Hi guys! In today's episode, I am going to focus more in depth about some of the very early signs of ASD that I saw with my son as early as 6 months old. So keep in mind that everything I discuss in this episode is from when he was only 6 months old. Every child will present differently, so this is unique to just my son because it is a spectrum. And I want to be able to capture these moments for my kids so that they can understand what happened in their lives and that their parents tried their very best to make the best decisions for them. If you missed episode 1, my son is now 6 years old and was diagnosed with ASD at the age of 2. So I'm going to get right into it. When my son was only 6 months old, I noticed some behaviors. So, of course, I brought it up to his then pediatrician, and I brought up 5 specific behaviors that I thought were concerning, possible signs of ASD that he dismissed. And I know this information specifically because I emailed my son's pediatrician since this was during COVID and we had to quarantine. So I have everything captured in emails, which is why I'm able to recall that there were 5 specific behaviors that I brought up to the pediatrician that was dismissed. So in the email, I mentioned hand flapping, noise sensitivities, crying in unfamiliar environments, scratching everything, and on and off responding to his name. So the pediatrician replied to my email and said not to worry at this age because babies tend to mess with their hair and their ears. He said to keep observing his noise sensitivities and, that some kids can be very sensitive to certain sounds, but there's not much to do, especially if it doesn't cause dysfunction socially or academically. At the time, I took his word for it and I let it go. Keep in mind that this is a few months into COVID and no one left the home. Everyone wore masks. There was no social life. In a way, I found comfort in believing that his behaviors were due to the pandemic. And if his pediatrician wasn't worried about it, then I was okay too. I'm going to break down each behavior and talk about it more in detail. So I'll start with scratching. To be honest, I didn't even know what stimming was. So stimming is a repetitive physical movement, sometimes used to manage sensory input, such as stress or emotions. Scratching, even for a 6-month-old, could have been an early sensory seeking behavior. Since a lot of ASD kids have sensory processing, differences, how they process information in the world is unique. So scratching could have given him that feedback or input that he needed to regulate or soothe himself. And certain textures could have been regulating to him or his body. He was already stimming at the age of 6 months, which I've now learned that everybody does. Everybody stims. For example, my stim is touching my hair on a specific spot that I never realized, somehow it does regulate me and it calms me. And this leads me into the next behavior, which is hand flapping, which is also another type of stimming. So hand flapping is one of the most common signs of ASD, I think, and I feel that this is a sign that is more well known. So the flapping movements or waving of the hands or arms can be like up and down or side to side, sometimes, or any kind of motion, right? And it can occur when a child is excited or when they have sensory overload or when they're bored. There can be many reasons why a child would hand flap, and it is a form of stimming. Where I got stuck when I was, doing my own research at the time about hand flapping is, it mentioned that neurotypical children also hand flap and that it's transient. I was optimistic that it would be fleeting based on him meeting, other milestones. So the next behavior that seemed a little bit off to me was when I would call my son's name. He responded very inconsistently. There were times he didn't want to engage when I called his name, even if I did it repeatedly. He kind of seemed to be in his own world, despite me trying to get his attention and engage with him. Loud noises. Loud noises used to bother him, and it still does to this day. Not just loud noises, but also like sensory overload, I think, coincides with loud noises. But I remember one time when he was 6 months old, my mom was feeding him a bottle of milk, and she accidentally dropped the bottle of milk on the floor, and he cried hysterically because of the loudness of the bottle dropping. And I thought at that moment that was a little strange, but I didn't really think anything of it, at the time. Lastly, my son used to cry a lot when we would go somewhere new. I did not understand why, and it made it difficult for us to want to go anywhere, because most people don't understand that it's hard at the moment, but also equally difficult when we return home, just to be met with sensory overload and more crying. So those are the 5 specific, behaviors that I saw that were a little bit concerning to me, that I brought up to my son's pediatrician at the time of only 6 months old. And unfortunately, it was dismissed. It wasn't really pursued further, and I understand it was during the pandemic. So a lot was going on. But to close out this episode, I now understand that my son needs routine and structure, but is also learning to be flexible. He uses headphones when he needs them, and it doesn't always work. And any stimming in our household is welcomed as long as they are not harmful, unsafe, or disruptive to daily living activities. I am a big advocate for allowing my kids to be themselves as long as they are safe and functional. Thank you again so much for being here and listening. And to my kids, if you're listening someday, I love you both so much.